On June 24, 1973, a fire broke out inside a gay bar in New Orleans called the UpStairs Lounge, which claimed the lives of 32 people and injured another 15. The fire is largely suspected to be the result of arson, though no one was ever convicted of the crime. At the time, it was considered the deadliest attack towards the LGBTQ+ community and remains the deadliest fire in the city's history. The UpStairs Lounge was established during the early 1970s, located on the second floor of the Jimani Lounge in New Orleans' French Quarter. The bar served as a venue for the city's working-class homosexual population. This coincided with the gay rights movement picking up traction in the city, including some of its first protests organized by the Gay Liberation Front. The UpStairs Lounge hosted many social events and gatherings, including services for the Metropolitan Community Church, or MCC, the first openly gay Christian church in the nation. Since it wasn't uncommon at the time to get arrested in public simply for being gay, the UpStairs Lounge was a social haven where people could have fun and express themselves. The night of June 24, 1973 was busier than most days at the lounge. From 5 to 7 p.m. on Sundays, the bar had a drink special called Beer Bust, where patrons could get unlimited draft beer for just $1. After the special ended that night, roughly 60 patrons remained in the bar. At around 7:56 p.m., a buzzer was heard coming from downstairs, which usually meant that a taxi cab had arrived to pick someone up. Even though no one in the bar had called for a taxi, bartender Buddy Rasmussen asked for Luther Boggs, one of the bar's patrons, to answer the call. When Boggs opened the door to the staircase, he was met with a sudden backdraft as the staircase was completely engulfed in flames. The fire spread quickly throughout the venue as combustible items such as the wallpaper and carpet only helped it grow. While there was an emergency exit, it wasn't properly marked, so few of the patrons even knew it existed. Buddy Rasmussen, who did know about the exit, was able to escort over a dozen people to the building's roof, where they moved to another building next door to climb down to ground level. For the remaining guests inside the lounge, however, escape was nearly impossible. The windows were blocked by iron bars with gaps only 14 inches wide, leaving patrons struggling to squeeze their way through. At least one patron did manage to escape from one of these windows, though he ended up plummeting to his death, with his body left burning on the sidewalk below. Many others got trapped trying to squeeze their way through the bars, including Bill Larson, a reverend for the MCC. His charred body was found sticking partway out of a window and could be seen by onlookers for hours after the fact. Another member of the MCC, Assistant Pastor Dwayne George Mitchell, was one of the many people rescued by Rasmussen. However, he rushed back inside to try and rescue his partner, Louis Horace Broussard. Their bodies would later be found embracing each other inside the bar. A fire station was located about 2 blocks from the lounge, but responding firefighters were partially blocked by the many cars and people surrounding the building. It took them about 15 minutes to get the inferno under control. The bodies of 28 victims were found inside the lounge. A majority of them were found huddled together in the southeast corner, right next to the venue's bar. Another person died on their way to the hospital. 18 others were severely injured, with 3 of them succumbing to their injuries in the following days. This included Luther Boggs, the man who initially discovered the inferno, who suffered third-degree burns to over 50% of his body. 59-year-old Willie Inez Warren also died while in the hospital and was the only woman to die from the blaze. Her 2 sons, 26-year-old James and 24-year-old Eddie, also lost their lives. The New Orleans Fire Department and Louisiana State Fire Marshal's Office began investigating the fire's cause, and after examining the scene and listening to witness testimonies, they determined that someone intentionally started the fire after dousing the first few steps of the staircase with lighter fluid. A Walgreens employee claimed seeing an unidentified individual purchase a can of lighter fluid identical to the one found at the scene. A teenager did confess to the crime, but had a clear alibi and passed a polygraph test, and later recanted his confession. The prime suspect in the arson was a gay man by the name of Roger Dale Nunez. According to an eyewitness statement, Nunez was seen in a violent altercation with another patron at the bar shortly before the fire started. He was kicked out of the establishment and was supposedly heard saying, "I'm going to burn this place down." Police located him at his apartment a week after the fire, but learned that he suffered a broken jaw from his previous altercation at the bar. Nunez was then sent to Charity Hospital to get jaw surgery. Once he recovered, the hospital failed to notify the police of his release, so they spent months trying to locate him again. Authorities were finally able to track him down again, where he denied responsibility during questioning. Nunez had a history of mental illness and was treated at multiple psychiatric facilities before and after the fire took place. He also supposedly confessed to the arson multiple times to a friend of his. He would end up taking his own life in November 1974. 6 years later, the State Fire Marshal's Office announced that the case was closed after a lack of leads, and no convictions have been made to this day. Over a dozen lawsuits were filed against the owners of the bar for its severe lack of safety standards, including the lack of accessible exits and the highly flammable decor of the lounge. The city was also sued for failing to properly carry out an inspection of the building for 2 years before the tragedy occurred. The cases against the city officials were dropped, while the owners only had to pay $80,000 to the victims' families. Since homosexuality was still a taboo subject during the early 1970s, many news outlets and public officials understated the severity of the disaster, if not refraining from discussing it entirely. Those that did comment on it typically neglected to mention that the victims were gay.
Firemen searched through this, burned building in New Orleans' French Quarter today, looking for evidence of arson. Fire broke out in a second-floor bar last night, killing 29 people and injuring 15. The stock markets opened the week.
One particularly egregious example was when the host of a radio show joked that the victims should be buried in fruit jars. The city's chief police detective, Major Henry Morris, described many of the bar's patrons as thieves. Some newspapers posted the names of the dead and injured, which subjected them and their families to ridicule and harassment by the public. One of the injured victims, a school teacher, was informed that he had been fired from his job while he was being treated at the burn ward. He would end up passing away the following day. Most churches in the city refused to hold funerals for those that were killed. The day after the deadly fire, Reverend William P. Richardson held a prayer service for the victims. Soon after, New Orleans Bishop Iverson Noland rebuked Richardson for holding the service. In response, Noland received over 100 angry phone calls and his mailbox became filled with hate mail. On July 1st, Bishop Finis Crutchfield held 2 memorial services to remember those lost in the fire. One of the service's participants was the founder of the MCC, Reverend Troy Perry. Once the services were over, many of the mourners walked out through the front doors of the church rather than the side doors to face the many news cameras that were present outside. This was done to demonstrate their lack of fear in facing the public in the wake of such a tragic event. Despite this, many families of the deceased wouldn't claim their loved ones' remains out of fear of being harassed themselves. This included the family of Bill Larson. Most of the victims had to be identified through dental records, with the exception of the bodies of 3 men. They were all buried in an unmarked grave at Rest Haven Cemetery, along with Ferris LeBlanc, whose body was never claimed. It wasn't until 2015 when LeBlanc's family learned that he died in the fire. In 2018, one of the unknown victims was finally identified as 32-year-old Larry Norman Frost. To this day, the identities of the 2 remaining bodies are still unknown. In 1998, the MCC held a service to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the disaster, which was attended by 300 members of the church. 5 years later, a plaque was built on the sidewalk in front of the lounge's building, listing the names of those that died that night. In 2022, the New Orleans City Council formally apologized for failing to properly acknowledge and investigate the tragedy nearly half a century prior. They also pledged to work towards properly burying the unidentified bodies. Councilmember J.P. Morrill called the city's response at the time beyond ridiculous and decried the dehumanization of those most affected. Quote, "In a city that prides itself upon being this haven of acceptance in a state of hate, we have to acknowledge that we also were a place of hate."